So you've decided it's time to upgrade your Sonos soundbar, but you don't know which to add first. A Sonos subwoofer or a pair of Sonos surround sound rears? Which is better value for money? If you're here for the short answer, it's pretty simple. Bass lovers who love listening to bass heavy tracks or the crash and rumble that you can feel in your bones when you're watching action movies, you don't need to overcomplicate things here. Add a Sonos subwoofer first. On the flip side, if you're the type of person who is all about immersion and wants to be surrounded by audio that comes at you from all angles and are worried that a subwoofer might be overkill for your space or disturb your neighbours, then a pair of surround sound speakers are the way to go. If that's enough to help you make a decision, then you're welcome. That's been our shortest video ever. If you decided a sub is the way to go, check out the Sonos subwoofer comparison here, and if you decided rears are the right step, read our blog here breaking down the best rears to add in different setups. If you need a bit more help deciding, don't worry. I've got plenty of tips to help you work out the right addition for your home and setup. Ideally, I chat with you all individually because this isn't a one size fits all, and the decision will depend on a number of factors. Generally though, the main factor will be sound performance and how these different upgrades will improve your audio. So we need to understand what adding a subwoofer or adding rears does to the overall performance of your setup. Adding a Sonos subwoofer will, of course, add extra bass to your audio. The level of added bass will depend on the subwoofer you go for. The Sonos Sub Mini, while a more compact option, packs a punch and delivers impressive bass for its size. But its bigger brother, the Sub Gen 3, is Sonos' more powerful subwoofer and delivers impactful bass that you can really feel. But it's not all about bass when you add a subwoofer. By design, both of these subwoofers are built to take the load of the lower frequencies from your other speakers or soundbar, therefore freeing up more processing power for them to deal with the dialogue and mid-range more effectively. So it's important to note that adding a subwoofer isn't going to just bring bass, it will also enhance the rest of the arrays too. Adding a pair of Sonos rears brings more immersion to your setup with surround sound. You've got loads of choice when it comes to rears, including the IKEA Symphonist range and even ceiling speakers or in-wall speakers via this Sonos amp. Opting for rears is a great option if you're looking to get a more complete soundstage and realistic performance. It's great if you watch a lot of TV or movies that have surround sound content, as you feel like the audio is coming from all around you, rather than just from the front of the room. So if a car was driving past, you'd hear it travel across the room more accurately. It's also good for music thanks to that more realistic, spacious soundstage effect too. So that's what you can expect if you add a Sonos sub or Sonos rears to your soundbar. From that, you might know what type of performance upgrade you would prefer according to your own listening preferences, and that's a huge deciding factor on which way to go. But there are 3 other factors I think you can use to make your decision, and that is budget, soundbar pairing, and your space. For a lot of people, the budget is often one of the first deciding factors of the buying process and will naturally dictate what you go for next. If you want a straight answer, a pair of Sonos rears is typically a cheaper upgrade than a Sonos subwoofer. But now that Sonos have released the more affordable Sub Mini, that gap is much closer, making it a more difficult deciding factor. The 2 current subwoofer options come in at $749 and $449. Whereas you can pick up a pair of rears for under £200 if you were to go for the cheapest option of a pair of Symphonist bookshelf speakers. There are a lot more options when it comes to adding rears, all at a variety of price points, and you can spend more on rears, but the most common surround sound upgrade is around £350 to £400. The rears versus subwoofer debate can also differ depending on the Sonos soundbar you're adding to. Sonos' soundbar range currently includes the premium Sonos Arc, Sonos Beam Gen 2, and more compact Sonos Ray soundbar, and my recommendations do change depending on which you actually have. So first up is the Sonos Ray, and I think we've got to be realistic here. At $249, you're probably not considering adding a £700 subwoofer, so we can rule out the Sub Gen 3. If you're watching this video and haven't chosen your soundbar yet, then if you've got the budget, I think you're better off spending the money on a Sonos Beam Gen 2 rather than a Ray with sub or rears. However, you can still enhance the performance of the Ray with a Sub Mini or with a pair of rears if the Ray is the best option for your space. While the effect of adding rears would bring more immersion for your content, in general, I would recommend adding the Sub Mini to the Ray, as it doesn't just add bass, but as mentioned earlier, will also enhance the performance of the Ray too. However, if you've got a lower budget, then the IKEA Symphonist range is a more affordable way to give your Ray setup a boosted performance. Now, for Sonos Beam users, it's a great soundbar in its own right, especially for the price. but you can certainly take that performance even further. Traditionally, one of the most popular bundles was a Sonos Beam with a pair of two Sonos One SL rears. However, with the release of the Sonos Sub Mini at a lower price point, it's become a lot harder to choose between. The Beam Gen 2 and Sonos Sub Mini is a pretty killer combination in my opinion, and the two balance each other perfectly. They're at a great price point for each other, and when we tested adding a Sub Mini with the Beam Gen 2, we were really impressed with how much it enhances the overall performance in both terms of bass, but also with other arrays. The shift in processing power is a great improvement for the Beam, as vocals become more pronounced and mid-range really steps up a gear, which ultimately adds more life to the Beam and adds a completely new layer of immersion. For a lot of people, this would be a great setup and will give a satisfying upgrade to the Beam Gen 2. However, as the Beam doesn't have dedicated upwards firing drivers and therefore offers simulated Dolby Atmos, those craving a more immersive soundstage which puts you in the center of the action with the audio coming from all around you will prefer the effect you get from adding a pair of rears. The Sonos Arc throws a bit of a spanner in the works with dedicated upwards and sideways firing drivers for 3D Dolby Atmos effects. The Sonos Sub Gen 3 is a natural pairing for the Sonos Arc, and while the Sub Mini is another option, for a lot of spaces and setups, the power of the Sub Gen 3 better matches the performance of the Arc. You've got the immersive Atmos effects already from the Arc, so for those who want to push the Arc itself even further, adding a Sub Gen 3 subwoofer would be the way to go. However, if you're already happy with the level of bass you get from the Arc, then you might find that adding a pair of rears is the finishing touch for your setup and takes immersion up even further. Space is another big factor we think you've got to take into account when you're making your decision. Have you got the room to accommodate a sub in your lounge? Do you go for a Sub Mini for its smaller footprint? Or is a Sub Gen 3 the way to go because you can tuck it under the sofa? Are you planning on wall mounting your rears to have them at optimum listening height? Or do you need to find some space for a pair of stands? Do you have one main seating area, or is it all spread around your room, making placement of a pair of rears quite difficult? These are all questions you need to be asking yourself to ultimately make the entire process much simpler in the long run. Now, I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but it's also worth questioning what are your other limitations of your space that you can't control. Do you have neighbours nearby who wouldn't appreciate a deep and rumbling bass unit? Or do you share an adjoining wall with them, which might cause an issue? Are you in a rental property so wall mounting your rears isn't an option? Again, all things to keep in mind as you're weighing up your options. For the majority of us, sound performance is always going to take pride and place as the most important part of the buying process, but don't overlook the real life practicality of setup. It's often these elements that will make your decision for you. And remember, the sub and rears aren't mutually exclusive, and if you've got the budget, then by all means get your hands on both and enjoy the full Sonos 5.1 home cinema experience. Right, I've done my best to break down the decision-making process for you, but sometimes you just need to see what other people are doing to really add that extra bit of clarity. Thankfully, I've got a couple of scenarios that should do exactly that. Scenario 1, meet Greg. He lives in a 2-bed rented apartment with what he would class as a small-sized living room. He's a massive gamer and generally watches lots of sports on TV, as well as a lot of movies. He's currently got a Sonos Beam Gen 2 and would love a full 5.1 home cinema setup further down the line, but hasn't quite got the budget just yet. He's happy with the performance of the Beam, but is looking to really immerse himself in his content without disrupting his neighbours. Regardless of whether he's playing FIFA or watching the Six Nations, he wants to feel the crowd all around him. He's going to be buying a pair of Sonos surround sound rears first. Scenario 2, meet Liv and Mike. They've just moved to a detached 3-bedroom house with a pretty large living room. They've got a Sonos Arc already and they're planning on getting both a subwoofer and rears eventually. They love having guest rounds and hosting a party, as well as winding down with a movie night, watching the latest blockbuster release. They're not concerned about budget, they just want the best of the best. They're going to go for the Sonos Sub Gen 3 first, and maybe over time, add a pair of rears. Finally, scenario 3, meet Steve. He lives in a 2-bed house with a medium-sized lounge, and he's also got a Sonos Beam Gen 2. He loves listening to bass-heavy music like R&B and rock, and also loves a good action-packed film or TV series. He's got a budget of around £500 right now, so for him, he's going for the Sonos Sub Mini. Are you a Greg, a Liv and Mike, or a Steve? Obviously, there's plenty more scenarios and factors to take into account, but hopefully this has helped you to get a little closer to your final decision. For me, I'm Team Rears first, but that's just because I love the idea of complete immersion and the effects of having audio all around me. For those bass lovers out there, feel free to try and change my mind down below in the comments. Hopefully that's helped, but comment below or reach out if you'd like a more personal advice or pop into our showroom to have a listen yourself. If we're too far away, then we do offer a 30-day returns policy, so if you're on the fence, why not try it out at home? Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.